What if the biggest obstacle to changing your brain is not your intelligence, genetics, or motivation, but your inability to focus? Right now, millions of people are trying to improve their lives. They're reading books, listening to podcasts, buying supplements, and setting ambitious goals. But despite all of that effort, their brain never truly changes. Why? Because neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to rewire itself, depends heavily on focused attention. Here's what's really going on inside your brain. Every time you focus intensely on something, specific neural circuits begin firing together. When those circuits fire repeatedly with enough attention and emotional relevance, the brain starts strengthening those pathways. That's how you learn faster, break habits, improve memory, and build emotional resilience. But modern life is training the brain in the opposite direction. Constant notifications, short-form content, multitasking, dopamine overload, poor sleep, blood sugar instability. All of these fragmented attention creates fragmented neuroplasticity. In simple terms, if your focus is weak, your brain cannot change efficiently. And this matters far beyond productivity. Poor focus is linked to elevated cortisol, chronic fatigue, anxiety, insulin resistance, and accelerated cognitive aging. When your nervous system is constantly overstimulated, the brain struggles to enter deep learning states. What the research shows is that attention acts like a spotlight for neuroplasticity. The brain changes most efficiently when you deliberately direct focus toward one meaningful target. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine your brain is a garden hose. Attention determines where the water flows. If the hose sprays everywhere all day long, nothing grows deeply. But if you consistently aim that hose at one area, the neural pathways supporting that behavior begin strengthening rapidly. That is the biological basis of transformation. And one of the most important chemicals involved in this process is dopamine. Dopamine is not just about pleasure. It's about motivation, effort, and learning. Modern neuroscience shows dopamine directly influences attention, working memory, and the brain's willingness to exert effort. In today's video, we're going to break down exactly how to use focus to deliberately reshape your brain using science-backed tools grounded in neurobiology, sleep, nutrition, stress regulation, and dopamine management. You'll learn why multitasking destroys neuroplasticity, how deep focus rewires neural circuits, why your morning routine affects cognitive performance, and how to train your brain to enter powerful states of concentration naturally. Because the ability to focus is no longer just a productivity skill. It's becoming one of the most important biological advantages for long-term health, performance, and longevity. The first thing to understand is that focus is not simply a mental skill. It is a biological event. Most people think attention is something psychological, like motivation or discipline, but attention is actually the result of interactions between your nervous system, hormones, metabolism, and neural circuitry. When you focus intensely on something, your brain activates the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making, planning, and sustained attention. But the prefrontal cortex relies heavily on two neurochemicals, dopamine and acetylcholine. Dopamine creates motivation and goal-directed behavior. Acetylcholine acts like a spotlight, telling the brain which information matters and which should be ignored. Together, these chemicals create what neuroscientists call a plasticity state, where the brain becomes highly adaptable. What the research shows is that without focused attention, the brain does not strongly encode information. Passive exposure is not enough. You must engage attentively for the brain to physically rewire itself. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine construction workers repairing a road. Focus is the signal telling the workers exactly where construction should happen. Without that signal, nothing meaningful gets rebuilt. That's how neuroplasticity works. Attention directs the brain where to strengthen neural connections. And this has enormous implications for behavior change. If you repeatedly focus on distraction, stress, and rapid stimulation, the brain becomes better at distraction and impulsivity. But if you repeatedly train sustained concentration, learning, and emotional regulation, the brain adapts in that direction instead. Your brain is always changing. The question is whether you are directing that change intentionally. Now, here's where this becomes even more important. Most people today are damaging their focus through chronic dopamine overstimulation. Every notification, scroll, and novelty hit releases small bursts of dopamine. Over time, the brain begins expecting constant stimulation. Baseline dopamine drops, and normal activities start feeling boring. This is why many people can scroll social media for hours but struggle to focus for 20 minutes. That is not laziness. That is a nervous system conditioned toward fragmented attention. Research continues showing chronic digital multitasking is associated with reduced attentional control and lower working memory performance. And there's also a metabolic component. Blood sugar instability strongly affects cognitive performance. When glucose spikes rapidly from ultra-processed foods and then crashes, the brain experiences fluctuations in energy availability. This can impair concentration, increase irritability, elevate cortisol, and worsen mental fatigue. The brain consumes enormous energy relative to its size. Even mild insulin resistance can begin affecting cognitive performance over time. This is why highly processed diets are linked with poorer executive function and attention capacity. So when someone says, "I can't focus," the root cause may actually be sleep deprivation, dopamine overload, chronic stress, nutrient deficiencies, blood sugar dysregulation, poor circadian rhythm. This is why root cause thinking matters. You don't fix focus by simply trying harder. You optimize the biological systems that create focus. So what can you do immediately? First, reduce unnecessary attentional fragmentation. For at least 1 hour each day, remove notifications, silence the phone, and train the brain to tolerate sustained focus again. Second, stabilize blood sugar. Prioritize protein, healthy fats, and fiber earlier in the day. Avoid large sugar-heavy breakfasts that spike and crash glucose rapidly. Third, get morning sunlight exposure. Research consistently shows early day sunlight helps regulate dopamine, cortisol timing, circadian rhythm, and alertness. Fourth, deliberately practice concentration. Even 10 to 15 minutes of uninterrupted focus begins strengthening attentional circuitry. And here's the key point. Focus is not merely about getting more done. Focus is the biological trigger for changing your brain. If this is helpful so far, consider subscribing. I post content like this every day focused on optimizing brain health, energy, and longevity naturally. To truly understand focus, you have to understand dopamine. Dopamine is often described as the pleasure molecule, but that's incomplete. Dopamine is more about pursuit than pleasure. It's the chemical of motivation, anticipation, effort, and reinforcement. In simple terms, dopamine tells the brain, "This matters. Move toward it again." And that mechanism directly shapes your ability to focus. Whenever you engage in behaviors involving novelty, reward, or stimulation, dopamine is released from deep brain structures involved in motivation and learning. In healthy amounts, this is beneficial. Dopamine helps you stay motivated, learn faster, persist through difficulty, build habits, maintain attention. But the problem today is not dopamine itself. The problem is the unnatural frequency and intensity of dopamine stimulation in modern environments. Social media, constant notifications, ultra-processed foods, endless scrolling, rapid novelty. These create repeated dopamine spikes throughout the day, and over time, the brain adapts. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine sitting in a dark room with one candle. That candle looks bright. But if someone suddenly turns on stadium lights, the candle now seems weak. That's what chronic overstimulation does to your dopamine system. Normal life begins feeling underwhelming. Reading becomes harder, studying feels painful. Deep work feels boring, silence feels uncomfortable. Not because your brain is broken, but because your reward circuitry has adapted to constant stimulation. Research shows dopamine heavily influences cognitive effort allocation. Higher dopamine availability is associated with greater willingness to engage in mentally demanding tasks. And dopamine is tightly connected to attention span. When dopamine signaling becomes fragmented through constant novelty seeking, attention itself becomes fragmented. This is why people constantly jump between emails, messages, videos, apps, work tasks. Their nervous system is unconsciously seeking the next dopamine pulse. But every switch comes with a neurological cost. Researchers call this attention residue. Part of your cognitive energy remains attached to the previous task, reducing performance on the current one. In other words, multitasking is neurologically expensive. And this matters enormously for neuroplasticity. The brain changes most effectively when attention remains stable long enough for neural circuits to strengthen. Now, here's something even more important. The brain rewards effort-based dopamine differently than passive dopamine. Passive dopamine comes from scrolling, junk food, endless entertainment, constant novelty. Effort-based dopamine comes from exercise, deep learning, skill acquisition, meaningful work, delayed gratification. And effort-generated dopamine creates more sustainable motivation and resilience over time. This is one reason exercise improves cognitive performance so dramatically. Movement improves dopamine receptor sensitivity while also increasing blood flow, insulin sensitivity, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which supports neuroplasticity. Studies continue showing aerobic exercise enhances executive function and attention regulation. Now let's connect this to practical daily life. If your brain is constantly overstimulated, one of the most powerful things you can do is reduce unnecessary dopamine spikes. Not eliminate pleasure, not become extreme, but restore balance. Here are several highly effective protocols. First, delay highly stimulating inputs early in the morning. Avoid immediately checking social media, email, or entertainment after waking. Your dopamine system is especially sensitive in the first hour of the day. Second, practice single tasking. Choose one cognitively demanding activity and work on it without interruption. Third, intentionally introduce low stimulation moments. Walk without your phone. Sit quietly. Eat without screens. This helps recalibrate baseline dopamine sensitivity. Fourth, earn dopamine through effort. Exercise regularly. Learn difficult skills. Create instead of constantly consuming, because one of the greatest mistakes people make is trying to feel motivated before taking action. But biologically, motivation often follows effort. Action generates dopamine, and dopamine reinforces future action. That loop is how habits become identity. One of the most dangerous myths in modern culture is the idea that multitasking makes you more productive. Neurologically, it does the opposite. Your brain was not designed to perform multiple high-level cognitive tasks simultaneously. What most people call multitasking is actually rapid task switching. And every switch forces the brain to pay a metabolic and attentional penalty. When you move from one task to another, checking a message while working, scrolling during study sessions, answering emails while listening to something else, the prefrontal cortex must repeatedly reorient itself. That process consumes glucose, neurotransmitters, and attentional resources. Over time, constant switching weakens your ability to sustain deep concentration. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine trying to dig a deep well for water. If you dig consistently in one place, eventually you reach water. But if you dig 50 shallow holes all over the ground, you exhaust yourself without reaching depth anywhere. That's what chronic distraction does to the brain. Your attention becomes broad but shallow, and shallow attention produces shallow neuroplasticity. This is one reason many people feel mentally exhausted despite not doing meaningful deep work. Their brain spends the entire day in a state of continuous partial attention, not fully focused, not fully resting, always scanning. That state elevates stress hormones while reducing cognitive efficiency. Research consistently shows interruptions and task switching impair working memory, reduce learning efficiency, and increase mental fatigue. But there's another layer most people overlook. Chronic distraction changes your reward circuitry. Every time you interrupt difficult work with something more stimulating, the brain learns discomfort should be escaped immediately. Over time, your tolerance for cognitive effort decreases. This is why many people struggle to read long books, study deeply, think critically, engage in sustained creativity. Their nervous system has been conditioned toward novelty instead of depth. And unfortunately, most digital platforms are engineered precisely for this outcome. The modern attention economy profits from fragmented focus. Now here's where this becomes deeply biological. Deep focus activates very different neural states than shallow distraction. When you sustain concentration on one task for extended periods, the brain begins synchronizing networks involved in memory, learning, and executive function. During these periods, dopamine rises steadily. Norepinephrine sharpens attention. Acetylcholine enhances signal clarity. Neural pathways strengthen more efficiently. This is the neurological foundation of mastery. And importantly, deep focus also affects emotional health. People often assume distraction reduces stress. Temporarily, it can. But chronically distracted brains tend to experience higher anxiety, greater emotional impulsivity, lower stress tolerance, increased mental fatigue. Why? Because attention fragmentation keeps the nervous system in a low-grade, hypervigilant state. The brain never fully settles. This also impacts sleep quality. Many people consume stimulation all day and then wonder why their mind races at night. The nervous system adapts to the environment you repeatedly expose it to. So how do you rebuild deep focus? First, create friction against distraction. Move your phone away during focused work. Disable non-essential notifications. Close unnecessary tabs. Second, train attentional endurance gradually. Do not expect immediate 3-hour concentration sessions. Start with 15 minutes, then 25 minutes, then 45 minutes. Attention works like a muscle. Third, use visual focus anchors. Writing things down reduces working memory overload and improves clarity. Fourth, protect your cognitive peak hours. For most people, focus capacity is highest within the first several hours after waking. Do your hardest thinking during your highest energy windows. And here's the most important idea in this section. The ability to focus deeply is becoming increasingly rare, which means it is becoming increasingly valuable. If this is helpful so far, consider subscribing, because in the next section, we're going to explore how sleep, cortisol, circadian rhythm, and metabolic health directly determine your brain's ability to focus and learn. If you want to improve focus, memory, and neuroplasticity, you cannot ignore sleep. Because sleep is not simply rest. Sleep is an active neurological repair process. Many people try to improve focus with caffeine, supplements, or productivity hacks while ignoring the biological foundation that makes attention possible. Every night during deep sleep and REM sleep, the brain performs critical maintenance functions: neural repair, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, dopamine receptor recalibration, synaptic pruning. That last one is especially important. Throughout the day, your brain forms countless temporary neural connections. During sleep, the brain strengthens important pathways while removing weaker, unnecessary ones. In simple terms, sleep helps the brain decide what to keep and what to discard. Without adequate sleep, attention weakens, reaction time slows, emotional control decreases, learning efficiency drops, motivation declines. And one of the first brain regions affected by sleep deprivation is the prefrontal cortex, the exact area responsible for focus and decision-making. Research consistently shows that even partial sleep restriction significantly impairs attention and executive function. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine trying to run advanced software on a phone that never fully charges overnight. The device still works, but everything becomes slower and less efficient. That's exactly what chronic sleep deprivation does to your nervous system. And here's where this becomes even more important. Poor sleep also disrupts metabolic health. When sleep declines, cortisol rises, insulin sensitivity worsens. Hunger hormones become dysregulated, blood sugar regulation becomes impaired. This is one reason people crave highly processed carbohydrates after poor sleep. The brain is searching for fast energy, and unstable blood sugar further worsens cognitive performance. This creates a vicious cycle. Poor sleep leads to worse glucose control, lower focus, higher stress, more dopamine-seeking behavior, and then even worse sleep. Now let's talk about cortisol. Cortisol is not bad. It's essential for alertness and energy mobilization. The problem is dysregulated cortisol timing. In healthy physiology, cortisol rises naturally in the morning to promote wakefulness and then gradually declines throughout the day. But chronic stress, excessive nighttime light exposure, poor sleep habits, and constant stimulation can disrupt this rhythm. As a result, morning energy declines. Afternoon crashes worsen. Evening anxiety increases. Sleep quality deteriorates. And unfortunately, many people try solving this with more caffeine. But excess caffeine, especially later in the day, can mask fatigue while worsening sleep quality underneath. Now here's the encouraging part. Sleep quality is highly trainable. Small behavioral changes can dramatically improve brain performance. First, get morning sunlight exposure within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Sunlight helps synchronize cortisol timing, melatonin production, dopamine regulation, and alertness. Second, reduce bright artificial light at night. Your brain uses light cues to determine biological time. Bright nighttime light delays melatonin release. Third, stabilize sleep and wake times. Your brain thrives on rhythmic predictability. Fourth, avoid massive late-night meals and excessive sugar close to bedtime. Large glucose swings during sleep can disrupt recovery. Fifth, use caffeine strategically. Many experts recommend delaying caffeine intake 60 to 90 minutes after waking and limiting intake later in the afternoon. Now here's the key idea. You cannot consistently outperform your biology. Focus emerges from a healthy nervous system operating in alignment with circadian rhythm, metabolic stability, hormonal balance, and recovery. One of the most powerful things neuroscience has revealed is that the brain is not designed to focus at maximum intensity all day long. It operates in cycles, and understanding these cycles can dramatically improve learning, productivity, and neuroplasticity. Your body runs on biological rhythms. Most people have heard of circadian rhythms, the 24-hour cycle controlling sleep, hormones, and alertness. But within that larger cycle, the brain also operates through shorter performance waves called ultradian rhythms. These are natural cycles of heightened focus, followed by periods of reduced cognitive efficiency. Typically, the brain can sustain deep concentration for about 90 minutes before performance begins declining, and this is critical to understand. Many people mistakenly believe peak performance means constantly pushing harder without interruption. But biologically, sustained high output without recovery reduces attention quality, increases stress hormones, and weakens learning efficiency. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine sprinting. You could sprint intensely for a short period, but not continuously for 12 straight hours. The brain works similarly. Deep focus is metabolically expensive. The prefrontal cortex consumes enormous energy during concentration. Glucose utilization rises. Neurotransmitters are depleted. Neural firing increases. Mental fatigue accumulates. This is why long periods of shallow work often feel strangely exhausting. The brain never fully enters deep focus, but it also never fully recovers. Research on ultradian performance cycles suggests strategic breaks improve learning retention, creativity, and sustained performance. Now here's where this becomes extremely powerful for neuroplasticity. Focused attention combined with deliberate recovery creates ideal conditions for brain adaptation. During intense concentration, acetylcholine sharpens focus. Dopamine reinforces effort. Norepinephrine enhances alertness. Neural circuits strengthen through repetition. Then, during recovery periods, the brain begins consolidating information and resetting attentional resources. In simple terms, focus drives the signal. Recovery locks in the change. This is why many breakthroughs happen during walks, showers, or quiet reflection. The brain continues processing information even after active focus stops. One of the most effective protocols for brain optimization is scheduling deliberate deep work blocks. This means one task, one objective, minimal distraction, full attentional engagement. Define time boundaries, For many people, the ideal deep work window lasts 60 minutes, 90 minutes, occasionally up to 120 minutes. Beyond that, cognitive efficiency often declines sharply. And importantly, quality matters more than duration. 2 hours of true deep work can outperform 8 hours of fragmented attention. Now here's another fascinating mechanism. The brain associates environments with attentional states. If you repeatedly use the same space for focused work, the nervous system begins entering concentration more quickly in that environment. This is called context-dependent conditioning. That means working from bed weakens sleep associations. Constant phone use conditions distraction. Dedicated workspaces strengthen focus circuits. Even small environmental cues matter. Lighting, noise levels, clutter, posture. Now let's talk about one of the most overlooked aspects of deep focus: boredom tolerance. Modern brains have become highly intolerant of silence and cognitive friction. The moment difficulty appears, people seek stimulation. But here's the paradox. The ability to stay with mild discomfort is precisely what strengthens focus circuitry. When you resist the urge to check your phone during difficult work, you are literally training attentional control networks. And over time, focus becomes easier. Not because the task changed, but because your brain adapted. A simple, deep focus structure could look like this. Step 1. Choose one cognitively meaningful task. Step 2. Set a defined focus window. Step 3. Remove distractions before beginning. Step 4. After the session, deliberately recover. Walk, stretch, hydrate, breathe deeply. Because recovery matters enormously. And here's the key insight. Your brain changes according to what you repeatedly pay attention to. Focus is neurological investment. If this is helpful so far, consider subscribing. Because in the next section, we're going to put everything together into a complete daily protocol for building stronger focus, higher energy, and long-term brain health naturally. Now let's bring everything together into a practical daily system. Because information alone does not change the brain. Repetition does. Consistency does. Behavior does. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to transform their brain using extreme protocols they cannot sustain. Neuroplasticity responds best to repeated signals over time. Small actions repeated consistently become biological change. Every day, your brain is asking one fundamental question. What should I adapt to? Your routines answer that question. If your environment is built around distraction, overstimulation, stress, poor sleep, and fragmented attention, the brain adapts toward impulsivity and fatigue. But if your environment consistently supports deep focus, metabolic stability, recovery, and deliberate learning, the brain strengthens those pathways instead. That's how identity changes neurologically. Not through one breakthrough moment, but through repeated neural reinforcement. So let's walk through a practical brain optimization protocol. The first 60 to 90 minutes after waking are incredibly important for dopamine regulation, cortisol timing, and attentional stability. This is why your morning habits disproportionately shape the rest of the day. Step 1. Get light exposure as early as possible. Sunlight shortly after waking helps anchor circadian rhythm and improve alertness later in the day. Step 2. Avoid immediate dopamine overload. Do not begin the day with social media, endless email checking, or rapid stimulation. Protect your nervous system before the world captures your attention. Step 3. Hydrate and stabilize blood sugar. Hydration affects blood flow, cognitive function, and energy production. Then prioritize a protein-rich breakfast if it supports your energy levels. Protein provides amino acids like tyrosine, which support dopamine production. Stable blood sugar supports stable attention. Now let's move into the workday. One of the most effective things you can do is front-load cognitively demanding tasks earlier in the day. For most people, attentional systems are strongest within the first several hours after waking. Use those hours intentionally. Now here's a critical principle. Focus requires recovery. After intense concentration, take deliberate breaks. Not stimulation breaks, recovery breaks. There's a major difference. Scrolling social media during a break often keeps the nervous system activated. Instead, try walking, stretching, breathing exercises, looking outdoors, quiet reflection. Even brief moments of nervous system downregulation help restore attentional resources. Now let's talk about exercise. Exercise may be one of the most powerful cognitive enhancement tools available naturally. Movement improves blood flow to the brain, insulin sensitivity, dopamine signaling, stress resilience, sleep quality, BDNF production. BDNF acts almost like fertilizer for neurons. It supports learning, memory, and neuroplasticity. Research consistently shows regular physical activity improves executive function and cognitive performance across the lifespan. And importantly, exercise also helps regulate anxiety. A calmer nervous system focuses better. Now let's address supplementation briefly. No supplement replaces sleep, focus training, nutrition, or behavior. But some compounds may support cognitive performance in certain individuals. Omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium glycinate or threonate, creatine monohydrate, L-theanine, electrolytes. But remember, supplements amplify foundations. They do not replace them. And finally, let's discuss the most important concept of all. Attention is your life. Because whatever consistently captures your attention gradually shapes your brain, emotions, habits, identity, and future. Your nervous system is always learning. The question is, what are you training it to become? So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, one truth becomes very clear. Focus is not just about productivity. It is about brain change. It is about intentionally shaping the nervous system you will live with for the rest of your life. Your neural circuits are constantly adapting to repeated experience. What you repeatedly pay attention to becomes strengthened. What you repeatedly ignore becomes weakened. That is the fundamental law of neuroplasticity. And whether people realize it or not, modern life is training the brain continuously. Every notification, every distraction, every late night, every dopamine spike, every stressful multitasking session. All of it leaves a biological imprint. But the encouraging part is this: the brain remains adaptable. At almost any age, the nervous system can reorganize itself when given the right signals consistently. Throughout this video, we explored exactly what those signals are. We talked about how focused attention acts like a spotlight for neuroplasticity. We explored dopamine and how modern overstimulation is conditioning many people toward distraction and shallow attention. We discussed why multitasking weakens cognitive performance and why deep focus is becoming increasingly valuable. We covered how sleep, cortisol regulation, blood sugar stability, circadian rhythm, and metabolic health directly influence your ability to concentrate and learn. And finally, we broke down practical daily protocols: morning sunlight, stable routines, reduced digital overstimulation, deep work blocks, exercise, recovery cycles, intentional attention training. None of these tools are extreme, but together they become transformational. Let me explain this with one final analogy. Imagine your brain like a forest trail. Every time you repeat a behavior, you walk that trail again. At first, the path is weak and overgrown, but with repetition, it becomes clearer, easier, and more automatic. That is how habits form. That is how identity changes. That is how focus strengthens. And importantly, this process works both ways. If you repeatedly train distraction, the distracted brain becomes your default. But if you repeatedly train sustained attention, emotional regulation, and deep work, the brain adapts toward clarity and resilience. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Now, here's the challenge I want to leave you with. Do not try to overhaul your entire life overnight. Instead, choose one change. Maybe it's 20 minutes of uninterrupted focus each morning, putting your phone away while working, getting sunlight after waking, going to sleep consistently, taking real recovery breaks. Pick one behavior and repeat it consistently for the next 7 days. Then observe what happens. Watch your energy. Watch your focus. Watch your emotional state. Because once you begin training your attention intentionally, you start reclaiming control over your nervous system. And ultimately, that means reclaiming control over your life. If this video added value, make sure to like the video and subscribe to join others optimizing their brain, energy, and longevity naturally. And remember, your attention is one of the most powerful biological resources you possess. Protect it carefully, train it deliberately, and your brain will change in ways most people never realize are possible.